Patients are hiding from physicians that they are using cannabis. Where do you think the trust was lost and how it can be gained between the physicians and patients concerning cannabis treatments?
It concerns both the patients and the doctors. Doctors are actually obliged to nurture trust with their patients. And patients, to the extent that they can, should identify doctors in whom they can place their trust. Otherwise, the interaction between patients and doctors is simply not what it is supposed to be. Now, as far as somebody on a higher level is concerned, there are certain things that can be done. So it could be possible to publicize more and make an effort to legitimize the use, the medical use of cannabis, at least the medical use, so that the patients will not feel uncomfortable and ashamed to tell about their experiences.
What do you think a physician can learn from patients' feedback?
Well, just about everything. I started using cannabis based on an observation that a patient took cannabis and had an extraordinarily good response, which could not have been achieved by any of the other means that we have at our disposal in the accepted pharmacopoeia. And following that, there was a certain period in Israel where we had relatively free access to cannabis, the physicians, and we could provide our patients with that cannabis. Now, what this and that molecule does is one thing, but the patients were getting the cannabis and were reporting to me what was happening, telling me about their experiences, and then we would try to figure out together how to proceed. And that is how I observed one patient and another patient, and gained a certain experience which I could then also check upon, comparing to whatever I could find in the literature, and get a certain perspective on it and move forward. Many of the things you learn come directly from the patients, but even if they do something you told them, don't do that, and they come and say, Doctor, look, you said don't do this, but I did it by mistake, or because my neighbor told me, or just because I thought that it would be better, and then I had a better result. And then they say, oh, fantastic, and I'll try to understand more in detail what they took and how they took it and what the response really was, and if there was anything else involved, and so on. This is the raw material with which you can actually build your experience. There's nothing else, because the molecules will not tell you what happened to the person.
How important is the selection of the right strain for treatment? Do you have enough strains available for patients in Israel?
Well, it was better until recently. There were more strains. Now there are less. The issue with strains is that, well, they're not precise. You do not get exact concentrations of specific cannabinoids, but there in general still is a certain trend in a certain direction, and you have the consistent experience that a certain strain is more appropriate for certain situations as compared to others. Okay? So if you, for example, there was a strain which was very effective for lack of energy and pain, but people sometimes would get very anxious with that strain. So you could tell if the person was a very anxious person and the situation evoked a lot of anxiety and so on. Depending, you could say, well, maybe there's something else that is better suited to you, or you could say you can take that strain but keep an eye open, and if there's any issue of anxiety, keep in mind that it could be the cannabis which is causing it, and then we will try to change the strain. So it is not exact, but it definitely can guide you in certain directions, and the strains definitely did have an impact. It is important to point out nowadays, because people are focusing on the concentrations of THC and CBD. So you can have different strains with identical concentrations of CBD and THC, but completely different effects. And that is something that you see clinically. There's no question about it. I mean, it is very distinct. And that really supports, at least at this point in time, the necessity to keep focused on strains. And then if you want to talk about the entourage effect, you can talk about the entourage effect, but that only has rhetorical value. The point is that somebody is taking something and that it is having the desired effect. And then if you want to explain it, you can. If you don't want to explain it, don't explain it. The effect is what matters ultimately.
Providing enough strains for patients would be quite important, as far as I understand.
Yeah, that is important, and it is also important to try to keep these strains consistent, of course. I mean, it is obvious that if you're talking about a strain that has a certain effect, then you want it to be the same all the time. And there is a problem, because this is nature, and there is a certain drift of characteristics of the plants, and then sometimes the same strain is less effective or more effective, but then you can shift to another strain, okay? But in a short period of time, for months, let's say, that strain or the products will still be consistent enough for the doctor and the patient to know what is required for him to deal with his medical problem.
It's never considered as the first option. Any explanation why?
Well, this is mainly a regulatory issue. Modern medicine is very formal, and actually doctors and the medical institutions sending these doctors to treat the patients are held responsible legally for how they proceed. So if you do not provide a patient with all the accepted means to treat a certain condition, then you are liable legally. He can go and litigate against you. He can go to court and say, this doctor, this medical institution did not provide me with what it is obliged to provide me with, obligated. And it is not obligated to provide the cannabis. So that is one way of viewing it and interpreting this phenomena of providing this condition that first the standard drugs and only after they fail cannabis. Nowadays the situation sometimes is so bad that even after failing everything and despite knowing that cannabis is safe, they still do not provide the cannabis. But let's put that aside. We are aware that many of the drugs which are provided in the standard system can be very harmful, and that this has come to the surface now with what the Americans call the epidemic of opioid use. And apparently cannabis is safer than opioids. I mean, it is quite obvious from a common sense perspective. The systems will always want something that is established and based on some kind of clinical trial, which may or may not be carried out. Basically, because cannabis is so safe as compared to these other drugs, and its effects are normally reversible, there's no reason to prevent people from trying it. And if they're doing well, then why move on to something that you know has much more potential for harm?